November 21st, 1944. A narrow street in Aachen's damaged city center. Sergeant Thomas Brennan of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division's Military Police Section stood outside a three-story building marked on his provost marshal map with a red circle. The notation read, Wehrmacht-regulated establishment. Intelligence reports had identified it as one of several brothels the German military had operated during occupation. Inside, voices spoke in hushed German. Women, maybe 6 or 7 of them. Brennan knocked. The voices stopped. The door opened slowly. A woman in her mid-20s stood in the doorway, her face pale, eyes darting past Brennan to the MPs behind him. She wore civilian clothes that had seen better days. Behind her, other women clustered in the dim hallway. None tried to run. They simply waited, shoulders drawn tight, hands clasped as if bracing for violence they'd been taught was inevitable. Brennan had expected defiance, or perhaps pleading. What he hadn't expected was the absolute terror in their expressions. Women convinced they were about to be punished, or worse. He glanced at the medical officer beside him, Captain Daniel Walsh, who carried a field medical bag instead of a sidearm. "Tell them we're here to help," Brennan said to the translator. "Food, medical care, they're not under arrest." The translator spoke. The woman at the door burst into tears. What happened next in Aachen, and later in dozens of captured German cities, would become one of the least told stories of American occupation. The moment when U.S. forces chose rehabilitation over retribution, proving that victory didn't require revenge and that humanity could survive, even in war's darkest corners. The military police section of the 1st Infantry Division received their assignments on November 22nd, 1944, the day after Aachen officially fell to American forces. Sergeant Brennan studied the provost marshal map spread across the hood of his Jeep. Red circles marked 6 locations across the battered city, Wehrmacht-regulated establishments identified through captured German municipal records and interrogations of civilian officials who had remained in the city. Intelligence officers explained what the circles represented. The Wehrmacht had operated a bureaucratic system of military brothels throughout occupied Europe and within Germany itself, treating them as military infrastructure equivalent to supply depots. The establishments in Aachen served soldiers rotating through the Western Front, operating under strict Wehrmacht medical supervision with scheduled health inspections and documentation. Some women had worked voluntarily, seeking survival income during wartime scarcity. Others had been coerced through labor office directives or direct pressure. Brennan and his MPs approached each location expecting armed holdouts or booby traps. The Battle of Aachen had lasted 3 weeks, reducing much of the medieval city center to rubble. German defenders had fought, building by building, turning hotels and administrative structures into fortresses. Every intact building represented potential danger, unexploded ordnance, stay-behind snipers, or desperate civilians. But the establishments on the provost marshal map contained only frightened women. At each location, the pattern repeated. MPs knocked. Long silence. The door opened slowly, women standing in dim hallways, faces drawn with terror, convinced they were about to be punished or executed. Nazi propaganda had spent years depicting Americans as brutal savages who would rape and murder German civilians. The women expected the worst. Instead, MPs distributed C-ration tins and told translators to explain that medical officers would arrive shortly. Captain Walsh conducted preliminary examinations on site, noting widespread malnutrition, untreated infections, and psychological trauma. The women wept, not from relief alone, but from the cognitive dissonance of discovering that the soldiers they feared were providing food and medical care instead of violence. European Theater Command Order No. 20, issued earlier that year, prohibited operation of any brothel under U.S. military control. The MPs closed each establishment immediately, posting guards to prevent Wehrmacht loyalists from attempting to restart operations. But closing the brothels created immediate problems. The women needed housing, medical treatment, and reintegration into civilian society. Military Government Detachment E1C2 hadn't planned for this specific scenario. Officers improvised. They reclassified the women as displaced civilians rather than criminals, making them eligible for temporary U.S. support. Wehrmacht had operated the establishments through a combination of regulation and exploitation, But under American military law, the women themselves had committed no prosecutable crimes. Treating them as victims rather than offenders represented a philosophical choice, distinguishing between Nazi leadership who caused the war and ordinary Germans caught in its machinery. The decision carried risk. Conservative elements in military government questioned whether providing aid to brothel workers sent the wrong message. But the alternative, arresting or abandoning vulnerable women, contradicted American principles and would generate hostility among German civilians, watching how occupiers treated even the most marginalized among them. By week's end, all 6 establishments in Aachen had been closed. 63 women received medical examinations, food rations, and temporary housing in requisitioned buildings. Reports traveled up the chain of command to chief headquarters, where staff officers recognized the precedent being set. Other German cities would soon fall. Each would contain similar establishments. Military government needed consistent policy rather than improvised responses at each location. But policy required resources, medical supplies, housing, administrative capacity, and every resource allocated to brothel workers was diverted from other urgent needs. Winter was coming. Food remained scarce. And the women themselves represented just one small fraction of Germany's displaced and desperate population, needing American assistance to survive. Captain Daniel Walsh opened his field medical bag in a requisition department building on November 24, 1944. The room smelled of damp plaster and coal smoke. 7 women sat on wooden chairs arranged against the wall, waiting for examinations. None made eye contact. Walsh had treated combat casualties for 18 months, shrapnel wounds, frostbite, battle fatigue. This was different. These patients feared the examination itself, convinced medical attention from American officers would somehow become punishment. The examinations revealed what Walsh had expected based on preliminary observations. Widespread malnutrition, women weighing 30 to 40 pounds less than healthy body mass for their heights. Untreated venereal disease in roughly 60% of cases, primarily gonorrhea and syphilis. Respiratory infections from living in unheated buildings through early winter. Dental decay from years of inadequate nutrition and no access to care. Several women showed signs of physical trauma, old fractures that had healed poorly, scars from untreated wounds. Walsh reviewed the Wehrmacht medical records captured when MPs closed the establishments. The documentation was meticulous: scheduled health inspections, recorded treatments, precise notations about which women were cleared for work and which required temporary removal. But the records revealed systematic neglect disguised as medical care. Wehrmacht doctors had monitored the women as military resources, not treated them as patients. Inspections focused on preventing disease transmission to soldiers, not healing the women themselves. The contrast between Wehrmacht and American approaches was philosophical. German military doctors viewed the women as assets requiring maintenance to preserve functionality. If a woman contracted syphilis, she received minimal treatment to prevent her infecting soldiers, then was removed from service when treatment failed. The Wehrmacht medical system documented disease but invested little in actually curing it. Records showed women suffering chronic infections for months, with only periodic inspections noting condition unchanged. Walsh administered penicillin to women with gonorrhea and began sulfa-drug regimens for those with syphilis. The new antibiotics transformed treatment. Infections that would have required months of painful mercury treatments or arsenic compounds could now be cured in days or weeks. American pharmaceutical production had made penicillin available in quantities sufficient for treating civilian populations, not just combat casualties. Walsh distributed vitamin supplements to address malnutrition, prescribed rest and increased caloric intake, and referred cases requiring dental work or surgical intervention to base hospitals. The medical treatment carried weight beyond immediate health benefits. Every injection of penicillin, every vitamin supplement, every dental referral communicated that American forces viewed these women as human beings deserving care. The Wehrmacht had treated them as resources. The Americans treated them as patients. The distinction mattered psychologically as much as medically. Army chaplains and social workers accompanied medical officers, offering psychological support and practical assistance. The women needed more than physical healing. Years of exploitation, social stigma, and fear of violent retribution had created trauma that antibiotics couldn't address. Chaplain William Foster, a Methodist minister from Ohio, spent hours simply listening, letting women talk about their experiences without judgment or interruption. Some had entered Wehrmacht brothels voluntarily, seeking survival income when other options disappeared. Others had been coerced through labor office directives or pressure from officials who controlled food rations and housing. The distinction between voluntary and forced labor blurred in wartime economy, where refusing cooperation meant starvation. Medical reports traveled up the chain to show off medical headquarters, where staff officers recognized the need for standardized protocols. Other German cities would require similar interventions. The Army Medical Department drafted guidelines for treating women from closed Wehrmacht establishments, mandatory examinations, antibiotic treatment for venereal disease, nutritional support, psychological counseling, and coordination with civil affairs officers for long-term housing and employment assistance. But medical treatment addressed only immediate physical needs. The deeper problem remained unsolved. After the women recovered, what happened next? German society viewed them as pariahs. Employment prospects were minimal, housing remained scarce, and the women themselves carried shame and trauma that wouldn't heal with penicillin. The medical intervention had saved them from disease and starvation, but saving them from social death required resources and commitment that extended far beyond Army Medical Department's capabilities. Major Robert Henderson of Military Government Detachment, E1C2, sat at a requisitioned desk in Aachen's damaged City Hall on December 1st, 1944. Before him lay a stack of files, one for each woman from the closed Wehrmacht establishments. The question facing him carried weight beyond immediate logistics. What legal status should these women hold under American occupation law? The categories were limited: enemy nationals subject to detention, criminals requiring prosecution, displaced persons eligible for humanitarian assistance, or simply German civilians living under military government authority. Each classification carried different implications for how much support the U.S. military could provide, and under what legal framework. Henderson consulted European theater command orders and found no direct guidance. Order number 20 prohibited operating brothels under U.S. control, but said nothing about the women who had worked in Wehrmacht-regulated establishments. International law offered no clear answer either. The Hague Conventions addressed treatment of prisoners of war and civilian populations under occupation, but didn't specifically address this situation. The practical question was simpler than the legal one. Had the women committed crimes under American military law? Wehrmacht had operated the establishments through bureaucratic regulation. German labor offices had directed some women there through coercive pressure disguised as employment placement. Economic desperation had driven others to seek survival income when conventional employment disappeared. Under Nazi Germany's wartime economy, the distinction between voluntary and forced labor had become almost meaningless. Refusing official directives meant losing food rations, housing, and any hope of survival. Henderson drafted a memorandum proposing to classify the women as displaced persons rather than criminals or detainees. Under this designation, they would be eligible for temporary U.S. support, food rations, medical care, housing, until German municipal authorities could resume civilian social services. The classification reflected philosophical choice, distinguishing between Nazi leadership who had caused the war and ordinary Germans caught in the machinery of totalitarian governance. The decision carried risk. Conservative voices in military government questioned whether providing assistance to brothel workers sent the wrong message about American moral standards. But Henderson's counter-argument proved persuasive. Arresting or abandoning vulnerable women would generate hostility among German civilians watching how occupiers treated even the most marginalized among them. The alternative, leaving them to starve or turning them over to German authorities who might punish them, contradicted stated American principles about humane occupation. Chief Headquarters approved Henderson's recommendation in mid-December. The women from Aachen's closed establishments received official classification as displaced civilians. They could draw food rations from U.S. Army supplies, access medical care through Army facilities, and occupy temporary housing in requisitioned buildings until German civil government could provide assistance. The precedent spread rapidly. Cologne fell on March 6, 1945. Frankfurt fell on March 29th. Munich fell on April 30th. Each city contained Wehrmacht-regulated establishments. In each city, military government officers applied the Aachen precedent: immediate closure, medical examination and treatment, reclassification as displaced persons, temporary support until German authorities could resume responsibility. The policy succeeded partly because it was consistent. Women in captured cities received predictable, humane treatment rather than depending on individual commanders' discretion. The systematic application prevented ad hoc brutality or exploitation that could have undermined broader occupation objectives. But the policy also revealed emerging American occupation philosophy. Unlike Soviet forces, whose treatment of German civilians in eastern territories generated mass terror and flight westward, American forces distinguished between punishing Nazi leadership and supporting ordinary Germans. The distinction wasn't always clear. Many ordinary Germans had participated actively in Nazi crimes, but the approach emphasized reconstruction over revenge, pragmatic cooperation over moral retribution. The women themselves represented just one small fraction of Germany's displaced population. By spring 1945, millions of ethnic Germans were fleeing westward from Soviet-occupied territories. Millions more had been bombed out of cities or displaced by combat. Prisoners of war, forced laborers from occupied countries, and concentration camp survivors added to the chaos. The women from closed Wehrmacht establishments numbered perhaps a few thousand across all captured German cities, statistically insignificant in the larger displacement crisis. But the policy established for handling them mattered beyond their numbers. It demonstrated that American military government would adapt policy to moral reality rather than rigidly applying pre-war legal categories. It showed that even societies most stigmatized could receive humane treatment under U.S. occupation. And it set precedent that would influence how American forces handled countless similar gray area situations, where people caught in war's machinery didn't fit neatly into categories of perpetrator or victim. The policy required resources that grew more strained as occupation expanded. Each city captured meant more displaced persons requiring support. Medical supplies, food rations, housing, administrative capacity, all were finite. Every resource allocated to one group meant less available for others with equally legitimate needs. And winter 1944-45 was brutal. Germany faced potential famine. The occupying power's responsibility for preventing humanitarian catastrophe competed with every other urgent priority. The Wehrmacht established its first military brothels in 1939, treating prostitution as a logistics problem rather than a moral question. High Command viewed regulated sexual access as military infrastructure, equivalent to supply depots, field kitchens, or motor pools. The system operated under the same bureaucratic efficiency the German military applied to everything else. Forms were filled out, schedules were maintained, medical inspections were documented with meticulous precision. By 1942, approximately 500 Wehrmacht-regulated brothels operated across occupied Europe. They served soldiers rotating through garrison towns, units withdrawn, from front lines for rest, and occupation forces stationed in captured cities. The establishments existed throughout Germany itself, in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, and the occupied Soviet territories. Wehrmacht command believed controlled access to prostitution would prevent venereal disease epidemics that had plagued German forces during World War I and maintain soldier morale during long deployments far from home. The system exploited multiple forms of coercion disguised as regulation. Some women entered voluntarily, seeking survival income during wartime economic collapse when conventional employment disappeared. German labor offices directed others through bureaucratic pressure. Women registered as unemployed received work assignments to Wehrmacht brothels with implicit threat that refusing meant losing food rations and housing. In occupied territories, the coercion became overt force. German military and police conducted street roundups, łapanka in Polish, rafle in French, kidnapping teenage girls and women to staff brothels serving occupation forces. Wehrmacht medical officers conducted mandatory health inspections on scheduled intervals, recording results in detailed files. The documentation resembled maintenance logs for military equipment. Women were resources requiring monitoring to ensure they didn't transmit disease to soldiers. When infections were detected, treatment was minimal, just enough to prevent spread, rarely enough to cure. Women who became too ill to work were removed from service, their fates documented with the same bureaucratic precision that recorded everything else. The system revealed how Nazi ideology's dehumanization extended beyond racial policy to economic exploitation. The regime that proclaimed devotion to German family values simultaneously created industrial-scale prostitution, serving soldiers, fathers, and sons. The contradiction didn't trouble Nazi planners because women in the system weren't considered full humans with agency. They were resources to be managed, monitored, and replaced when they broke down. The racial hierarchy that defined Nazi ideology permeated brothel administration. Establishments were segregated by nationality and rank. German women served German soldiers of appropriate rank. Polish women served Polish auxiliary forces. Different brothels existed for officers versus enlisted men. Jewish women were prohibited from Wehrmacht brothels under anti-miscegenation laws. They appeared in concentration camp brothels serving privileged Aryan prisoners, but never where they might encounter German military personnel. Concentration camp brothels represented the system's most grotesque evolution. Beginning in 1942, the SS established brothels in 10 major camps as part of a prisoner incentive program. Women from Ravensbrück and Auschwitz-Birkenau were forced into sexual slavery to reward privileged prisoners for productivity. At least 200 women served in camp brothels. Between 1942 and 1945, subjected to industrialized rape under strict surveillance. SS guards watched through spy holes, enforcing 15-minute time limits and preventing any human connection between women and their rapists. Across all Wehrmacht and SS establishments, military brothels, camp brothels, garrison establishments, historians estimate at least 3,440 women were forced into sexual slavery during Nazi Germany's war. The true number was almost certainly higher. Many records were destroyed. Many women's experiences went undocumented. The system operated with bureaucratic efficiency, but left gaps in its own accounting. When American forces captured German cities in 1944 and 1945, they inherited not just buildings but the human consequences of this system. The women in Wehrmacht brothels weren't abstractions or statistics. They were malnourished, diseased, traumatized individuals who had survived years of exploitation disguised as military administration. Some had entered seeking survival. Others had been coerced through economic pressure. Some had been kidnapped outright. All had been reduced to resources in a system that valued efficiency over humanity. The Wehrmacht records captured alongside the establishments revealed the full scope of bureaucratic evil. Health inspection logs showing women suffering chronic infections for months with notation condition unchanged. Work schedules treating women as interchangeable units. Replacement orders when women became too ill to continue service. The documentation was thorough, precise, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. American military government officers reading these records confronted the challenge of responding to institutionalized exploitation with policies designed for conventional warfare. International law addressed prisoners of war and civilian populations under occupation, but offered no framework for dealing with women who had been systematically exploited by the enemy's military infrastructure. The Wehrmacht had created a category of victim that didn't fit existing legal frameworks, and American forces had to improvise responses based on pragmatic humanity rather than established precedent. The system these women survived represented Nazi ideology's logical conclusion: bureaucratic efficiency applied to human degradation, military logistics extended to sexual exploitation, and state power used to transform people into resources. Understanding this context was essential for grasping why American treatment of these women mattered beyond immediate humanitarian concerns. How victors responded to what they discovered revealed as much about their own values as about the crimes they uncovered. Cologne fell to American forces on March 6, 1945. The ancient cathedral city lay in ruins, 90% of buildings destroyed by Allied bombing campaigns. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morrison of the 3rd Armored Division's Military Government Detachment entered the city with maps marked by Civil Affairs Intelligence officers. Red circles identified Wehrmacht-regulated establishments. There were dozens. Morrison had received briefing documents from SHAEF headquarters referencing the Aachen precedent. The approach was now standard procedure. immediate closure under European Theater Command Order Number 20, medical examinations and treatment by Army Medical Department personnel, reclassification of women as displaced persons eligible for temporary support, and coordination with whatever German civil authorities could be reconstituted to resume social services. The scale overwhelmed initial expectations. Cologne had been a major garrison city with Wehrmacht units rotating through continuously. The brothel system there had grown proportionally. Larger establishments, more women, more elaborate bureaucratic documentation. Morrison's detachment found 157 women across the various establishments. All required medical examinations. All needed immediate food and shelter. And Cologne's municipal infrastructure had been devastated by bombing. No civil authorities existed yet to hand them over to. Frankfurt fell on March 29th, revealing an even larger system. American forces found Wehrmacht brothels operating throughout the city, some serving enlisted personnel, others exclusively for officers. The class distinctions that permeated German military culture extended to its exploitation of women. Medical examinations revealed the same patterns identified in Aachen: malnutrition, untreated venereal disease, psychological trauma. Munich fell on April 30th. By then, military government officers had developed efficient procedures. Civil affairs teams entered the city with translators and medical personnel attached directly to advance units. Wehrmacht establishments were identified, closed, and the women processed through standardized protocols within days of the city's capture. The systematic approach prevented improvised responses that might have ranged from brutal to exploitative, depending on individual commanders' discretion. The policy's consistency created unexpected effects. Word spread through German civilian populations that American forces treated even society's most marginalized with unexpected dignity. Wehrmacht propaganda had depicted Americans as brutal oppressors who would rape, murder, and enslave conquered populations. The reality, medical care, food, shelter, contradicted the narrative. German civilians watching how occupiers treated brothel workers drew conclusions about how they themselves might fare under American authority. The propaganda value wasn't calculated initially, but SHAF headquarters recognized it quickly. Psychological warfare division officers noted that German civilian cooperation increased in cities where military government demonstrated humane treatment of vulnerable populations. The policy succeeded partly because it signaled that American forces distinguished between punishing Nazi leadership and supporting ordinary Germans caught in totalitarian machinery. But the humanitarian approach only worked because the United States possessed resources to back it up. Penicillin production had reached industrial scale. American pharmaceutical companies could supply antibiotics not just for combat casualties, but for treating German civilians. Food supplies came from American agricultural abundance. The U.S. could feed its own military, allied forces, and millions of displaced persons across occupied Europe simultaneously. Administrative capacity came from a military bureaucracy experienced in managing complex logistics across entire theaters of war. The policy was humane, but it was also a privilege of victory's abundance. German forces occupying Soviet territories in 1941-1943 had lacked resources even for their own soldiers. They couldn't have implemented similar humanitarian policies even if ideology had permitted it. Soviet forces entering Germany from the east in 1945 came from a nation devastated by 4 years of total war. They had nothing to spare for treating German civilians humanely, even if command structure had ordered it. American forces entering Germany from the west brought with them the economic power of the world's largest industrial economy, untouched by combat on its home territory, producing goods at scales no other nation could match. The medical care, food rations, and administrative attention given to women from Wehrmacht brothels represented a fraction of a percent of total occupation resources. But that fraction exceeded what most armies in human history could have allocated to any humanitarian purpose. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, military government had closed Wehrmacht brothels in every major captured city and processed over 2,000 women through the standardized protocols. Most eventually transitioned to care by reconstituted German social services. Some emigrated. Some disappeared into the chaos of post-war displacement. The records captured how many were helped. They didn't always record what happened afterward. The policy had succeeded in immediate humanitarian terms. Women received medical treatment, food, and shelter when they expected punishment or death. It succeeded in strategic terms. German civilians saw that American occupation emphasized reconstruction over revenge. But the deeper question remained unresolved. What happened to women who survived Wehrmacht exploitation but carried its scars into post-war society that viewed them as pariahs? The American military could provide temporary refuge. It couldn't provide redemption or social acceptance in the German communities, where these women would have to rebuild their lives. Frau Elisabeth Weber stood in the doorway of her damaged Cologne apartment in April 1945, watching American MPs escort a woman from the building across the street. One of the establishments closed under occupation orders. Weber recognized the woman. Everyone in the neighborhood knew what those buildings had been during Wehrmacht occupation. Now Americans were providing the women with medical care and housing assistance. Weber's reaction was complicated. Part of her felt relief that the occupation wouldn't be the brutal revenge Nazi propaganda had promised. Americans who treated even brothel workers humanely might treat ordinary Germans decently, but part of her resented what seemed like inappropriate kindness toward women she viewed as morally compromised. People who had collaborated with Wehrmacht exploitation, while Weber herself had struggled to feed her family on starvation rations. Her reaction wasn't unique. German civilian responses to American treatment of brothel workers ranged across a spectrum, shaped by exhaustion, fear, resentment, and cautious hope. Conservative elements, particularly clergy and older middle-class Germans, questioned whether providing medical care and support to prostitutes sent the wrong message about American moral standards. They had expected victors to punish immorality, not subsidize it with food and medicine. But younger Germans and working-class families drew different conclusions. The treatment suggested Americans distinguished between Nazi leadership and ordinary people caught in war's machinery. If occupiers could show compassion to society's most stigmatized, perhaps cooperation with occupation authorities offered path to survival rather than punishment. The policy became evidence that American occupation emphasized reconstruction over revenge. German municipal authorities gradually resumed social services through spring and summer 1945. American military government worked to reconstitute local German administration under Allied supervision, transferring responsibility for displaced persons from U.S. military to German civilian control. The women from closed Wehrmacht establishments presented particular challenges. German social workers had to place them in communities that viewed them as pariahs, find them employment when jobs were scarce, and integrate them into housing systems where neighbors knew their histories. American support continued during the transition. Military government provided financial assistance, logistical support, and medical supplies to German social services taking over care for the women. The cooperation revealed occupation's central paradox. Americans needed German cooperation to govern effectively, but punishing Germans for Nazi crimes might undermine that cooperation. The policy toward brothel workers embodied the compromise, holding Nazi leadership accountable while supporting ordinary Germans' recovery. The approach fit broader American occupation strategy. General Eisenhower had lifted fraternization restrictions in July 1945, acknowledging that prohibiting American soldiers from interacting with German civilians proved unenforceable and counterproductive. GIs formed relationships with German women despite official policy. They helped their German families with food and supplies. The humanity that individual soldiers showed contradicted Nazi propaganda depicting Americans as brutal oppressors. German civilians noticed the contrast with Soviet occupation in eastern territories. Reports filtering westward described mass rape, arbitrary executions, and wholesale looting by Red Army forces. Germans in the American zone understood they had gotten relatively fortunate occupiers. The realization shaped their willingness to cooperate with democratic reforms and market economy, restructuring that American military government imposed. But German civilian reactions also revealed the challenge of denazification. Few American soldiers encountered admitted Nazi sympathies after surrender. The nation that had enthusiastically supported Hitler's regime through 12 years suddenly contained no Nazis. German civilians claimed ignorance of concentration camps, forced labor programs, and aggressive wars their nation had waged. They portrayed themselves as victims, of Allied bombing, of Nazi leadership, of war's hardships. American soldiers found this collective amnesia frustrating and contemptible. They forced German civilians to tour liberated concentration camps, confronting them with evidence of crimes committed in their name. But many Germans continued insisting they hadn't known, hadn't participated, hadn't supported the regime. The brothel workers American forces treated humanely represented one small fraction of a population engaged in elaborate self-deception about its own culpability. The policy's success depended partly on Cold War context that emerged through 1945-1946. Soviet occupation brutality in Eastern Germany created stark contrast that made American approach look generous by comparison. As tensions between former allies escalated toward Cold War confrontation, American strategic focus shifted from punishing Germany for past crimes to rebuilding West Germany as bulwark against Soviet expansion. Support for displaced persons, including women from Wehrmacht brothels, became secondary to geopolitical objectives. The humanitarian concern that motivated initial policy gave way to pragmatic calculation about winning German cooperation for containment strategy. The women received care not purely from compassion, but because humane occupation policy served American interests in building stable, democratic, pro-Western German state. By 1946, most women from closed Wehrmacht establishments had transitioned to German civil care or disappeared into the chaos of post-war displacement. Some rebuilt lives under new identities. Some emigrated to avoid social stigma. Some never escaped the trauma of their exploitation. American military government had provided temporary refuge when they expected punishment, but it couldn't provide what they needed most: acceptance in German society that viewed them as moral failures rather than victims of systematic exploitation by their own governments. Military infrastructure. 75 years after Aachen fell, historians examining American occupation policy recognized patterns they hadn't noticed immediately. The decision to treat women from Wehrmacht brothels humanely rather than punitively hadn't been isolated or anomalous. It fit a broader occupation philosophy that distinguished American approach from Soviet brutality and helped transform defeated Germany into one of America's strongest Cold War allies. The policy mattered beyond its immediate humanitarian impact. By treating even society's most marginalized with unexpected dignity, American forces signaled that occupation wouldn't be the brutal revenge Nazi propaganda had promised. German civilians watching how Americans handled brothel workers drew conclusions about their own likely fate under occupation authority. The treatment created psychological opening for accepting democratic reforms, American military presence, and partnership with former enemies. West Germany became the Federal Republic in 1949, anchoring NATO's defense against Soviet expansion and evolving into Europe's economic powerhouse. The alliance succeeded partly because initial occupation emphasized reconstruction over retribution. American forces had distinguished between punishing Nazi leadership through Nuremberg trials, denazification programs, and dismantling totalitarian infrastructure, and supporting ordinary Germans' recovery through Marshall Plan aid, food shipments, and humane administration. The contrast with Soviet occupation in eastern territories was stark and visible. Red Army forces entering Germany from the east brought years of justified rage over Nazi crimes that killed 27 million Soviet citizens. Soviet soldiers raped an estimated 2 million German women, looted systematically, and dismantled industrial equipment for shipment to Russia as reparations. German civilians fled westward by millions, preferring American occupation to Soviet vengeance. American forces weren't perfect. Some committed crimes against German civilians. Fraternization restrictions were widely ignored, creating exploitative relationships between occupiers and defeated populations. But the overall approach was measured, bureaucratic, and aimed at creating stable, democratic West Germany, rather than extracting maximum punishment for past crimes. The policy toward brothel workers exemplified this philosophy in microcosm. Practical mercy backed by resources rather than vindictive justice that would have satisfied emotional impulses but undermined strategic objectives. The humane treatment was simultaneously genuine compassion and calculated strategy. Individual American soldiers like Sergeant Brennan and Captain Walsh acted from personal decency when they provided food and medical care to frightened women. But military government policy that codified their actions into standard procedure served American geopolitical interests in winning German cooperation for containing Soviet expansion. The two motivations became impossible to separate. Historians debating occupation success argue whether Mercy succeeded because it was backed by resources or because it reflected genuine American values. The answer is both. American economic power, pharmaceutical production that made penicillin abundant, agricultural surplus that could feed millions, industrial capacity that rebuilt infrastructure, enabled humane policies that poorer victors couldn't afford. But resource abundance alone didn't determine policy. Soviet Union possessed vast territories and resources, yet chose retribution over reconstruction in occupied Germany. American forces chose differently, partly from pragmatic calculation but partly from cultural values, emphasizing individual dignity and redemption. The policy's moral complexity reveals itself in unintended consequences. By treating brothel workers humanely, American forces helped some women survive and recover. But the policy couldn't provide what they needed most: acceptance in German society that viewed them as moral failures. American military government offered temporary refuge from immediate danger. It couldn't offer redemption or social reintegration. Many women who survived Wehrmacht exploitation carried its scars through lives shaped by stigma that American policy couldn't address. The legacy endures in how occupation success is measured. West Germany became prosperous, democratic, and reliably allied with the United States through Cold War decades. That success validated the occupation philosophy exemplified by the Aachen precedent, treating defeated enemies as potential partners rather than permanent threats, investing in reconstruction rather than maximizing punishment, and showing mercy backed by commitment to mutual prosperity. But the legacy also carries warnings about mercy's limits. The policy worked partly because it served American interests. If geopolitical calculations had differed, if containing Soviet expansion hadn't required winning German cooperation, would American forces have chosen the same approach? The question reveals how strategic calculation and moral principle intertwined until distinguishing between them became impossible. Modern occupations, Iraq, Afghanistan, countless smaller interventions, demonstrate that military victory doesn't guarantee successful reconstruction. American forces won decisive battlefield victories, then struggled to transform defeated enemies into stable allies. The contrast with Germany and Japan's successful transformations suggests that resource commitment, policy consistency, and willingness to treat defeated populations humanely matter as much as military power. The women from Wehrmacht brothels who received unexpected mercy from American forces in 1944-1945 represented one small fraction of occupation's vast complexity. Their story reveals how small policies illuminate larger values. How victors treat society's most marginalized signals how they'll treat everyone else. The mercy American forces showed wasn't perfect or comprehensive. It couldn't solve all problems or heal all wounds, but it created foundation for transformation from enemies to allies that endured for generations. The lesson is both pragmatic and moral. Victory's ultimate measure isn't battlefield dominance, but whether conquerors can transform defeat into partnership. Sometimes the most effective strategies aren't brutal domination, but unexpected mercy. But mercy only transforms enemies into allies when backed by sustained commitment to mutual prosperity, consistent policy that honors initial gestures with long-term action, and genuine willingness to treat former enemies as potential partners, deserving dignity despite their nation's crimes. The Aachen precedent succeeded because it was beginning, not end. The medical care, food, and shelter provided to brothel workers mattered because they preceded Marshall Plan reconstruction, democratic reforms, and decades of American commitment to German recovery. Small acts of humanity opened doors. American policy walked through those doors with resources and sustained effort that validated what initial mercy symbolized. 75 years later, the story remains relevant, precisely because it captures both power and limits of choosing compassion over vengeance, proving that how victors treat the defeated matters as much for pragmatic success as for moral principle.